The moving truck left tire tracks in the soft earth of the lane, deep grooves pressed into mud that hadn't fully dried from the week before. I stood in front of the farmhouse, my farmhouse now, legally, irrevocably mine, and felt the silence land on my shoulders like something physical, not oppressive, not heavy in the wrong way, more like a hand pressing gently between my shoulder blades, steadying me after a long stumble forward. My name is Matt Buckley. I am 28 years old. I am an Omega who spent 6 years living in a city that smelled of exhaust and ambition and other people's pheromones, and I needed to leave before it swallowed me whole. The farmhouse was old, genuinely old, not artificially aged for aesthetic purposes. The paint on the window frames was peeling in long, theatrical curls, the kind that looked like they'd been peeling since before I was born. The porch sagged gently on the left side. The front door, which I had unlocked for the first time 20 minutes ago with a key that felt absurdly large in my palm, had stuck in the frame with a groan that sounded more like protest than surrender. 3 of the upstairs windows looked out onto a view of open fields that extended all the way to a tree line I couldn't yet name. I didn't know the names of those trees yet. I didn't know any of it. That was, at least partially, the point. My Omega instincts, the ones I'd been suppressing with clinical precision for most of my adult life, had been sending me signals for years, not loud ones, not the dramatic, pulp novel surge of heat and longing that the internet liked to sensationalize. Just quiet, persistent signals, like a compass needle that keeps swinging toward magnetic north no matter how many times you turn the map around. I needed land. I needed quiet. I needed something that was mine in a way that a lease agreement in a 6th-floor apartment never quite was. So I bought a farmhouse in the countryside. I had not anticipated the neighbor. My nearest neighbor was a farm to the east, separated from my property by a low stone wall and a stretch of overgrown hedgerow. The listing had described it as recently sold, new ownership pending. I'd registered this the way you registered the fine print on a medication. Noted, filed, not worried about. Neighbors existed. Neighbors were manageable. I was good at managing things. I spent the first 3 days unpacking boxes and cataloging everything that needed repair. The list was long enough to be slightly alarming and interesting enough to be motivating. The kitchen needed new grout, 2 cabinet doors, and a faucet that didn't hesitate before producing water. The second bedroom had wallpaper that someone had applied over a previous layer of wallpaper, creating a kind of archaeological cross-section that I found fascinating and intended to strip by hand. The barn needed a structural assessment before I'd trust it to hold anything heavier than my intentions. I'd brought books, a good mattress, a second-hand kitchen table, and enough food to last a week without needing to go anywhere. This was deliberate. I needed time to settle into my own scent before the world outside started pressing on me again. Omega or not, everyone needs acclimatization. On the 4th morning, I was standing in the kitchen in my oldest sweater, the gray one with the fraying cuffs and the small burn hole near the hem from a candle incident I preferred not to dwell on, making coffee in a pot that took a philosophical amount of time to percolate, when I heard the truck. Not a moving truck, something heavier. Agricultural by the sound of it, with that specific diesel engine frequency that I associated vaguely with my grandfather, who had kept a small holding when I was young. I looked out the kitchen window toward the east and saw dust rising above the hedgerow, saw the shape of a vehicle moving along the lane that ran adjacent to the stone wall dividing our properties. New neighbor. I told myself I would go over and introduce myself eventually. Maybe in a few days, maybe after I'd gotten a proper handle on the state of my own fences. Or instead. It was barely 2 hours later when I was attempting to clear a section of the overgrown hedgerow closest to the wall, having decided that visibility between properties was less comforting than a clear boundary, and I heard a voice from the other side. "You're not going to get through that with a pair of garden shears." I straightened up and looked over the wall. The man standing on the other side was tall, broader than me by a significant margin. He was wearing a dark green jacket that had seen better days, jeans tucked into work boots, and he had his forearms resting on the top of the stone wall with the comfortable ease of someone who had been leaning on stone walls all his life. His hair was dark brown and slightly overgrown in a way that suggested he'd been meaning to deal with it for a while. His jaw had about 3 days of growth on it. His eyes, even from a few feet away, were a clear, light gray. Alpha. The scent of him reached me across the wall and the damp hedgerow, not overwhelming, not pushy. It rarely was at this kind of distance, but unmistakable. Warm, deep, something like cedar and freshly turned earth. The kind of scent that made my omega instincts, briefly and intensely interested in a way I was extremely practiced at setting firmly aside. I know, I said, perfectly evenly. I was going to order proper equipment. I just wanted to assess the extent of it first. He looked at me for a moment, not rudely, more in the way of someone who is taking an honest inventory. "Phil Casey," he offered, extending one hand over the wall. I shook it. His hand was warm and considerably larger than mine, which was not unusual, but which my traitorous nervous system saw fit to register anyway. "Matt Buckley." "You just moved in," he said, not a question. 4 days ago." "I just moved in," he said. 2 hours ago, more or less." There was something almost funny about it. 2 people arriving separately to adjacent farms within days of each other, as though the countryside had been waiting for its cast to assemble. "What are you doing with the place?" I asked, because it seemed the natural follow-on. "Sheep, eventually. Maybe some cattle further down the line. Trying to see what the land tells me first." He looked past me toward my farmhouse with that same calm, assessing gaze. "You?" "Kitchen garden, I think. Maybe an orchard if the soil's right. I want to learn the place before I start making too many commitments." He nodded slowly, as if I'd said something reasonable. Which I had, I thought. It was reasonable. "The hedgerow between us goes back a good 100 years, he said. "Hawthorn mostly. You'll want a proper billhook and probably a half day." "Do you speak from experience?" "I speak from looking at it on the way in and thinking about it for 2 hours. Something about that made me want to smile. I didn't, quite. "I'll get the equipment," I said. "Fair enough." He pushed back from the wall, standing to his full height, which was enough to be mildly inconvenient to my general composure. "I'll let you know if I figure out where the water main for the boundary wall runs. Should be shared, from what the survey said. I'll look for it from my side." He nodded once, turned to go, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. "There's a good ironmonger in town, about 4 miles north. They'll have what you need." "Thank you." He walked back toward his farmhouse, and I watched the way he moved for exactly as long as was reasonable, which was perhaps a second longer than it should have been. And then I returned my attention to the hedgerow and told my omega instincts in very plain terms to get a grip. The town, Wentbridge population small enough to feel like a secret, was a collection of stone buildings, a post office, a pub called the Green Hare, a bakery that smelled extraordinary from the street, and the ironmonger Phil had mentioned, which was staffed by an elderly man named George, who seemed to know everything about every tool in his shop without needing to look at any of them. I bought a billhook, a set of leather gloves, and a piece of advice about the soil composition of the valley floor that I hadn't asked for but found genuinely useful. I also, while in the bakery, discovered that a very small community is extremely interested in new arrivals. The woman behind the bakery counter, mid-50s, the kind of deliberate warmth that comes from genuine interest in people rather than commercial necessity, handed me a sourdough loaf and said with pleasant directness, "You'll be one of the 2 who've taken up the old Morrow farms." "I bought the West farm," I confirmed. "Matt Buckley, Sandra," she wiped her hands on her apron. "And the lad on the east side? Is he with you?" "No," I said. "We just met over the wall this morning. He's called Phil Casey." Sandra looked at me with an expression that was deeply, professionally neutral. 2 young men taking on farms by themselves. That's unusual these days. "I think most things happen for their own reasons," I said mildly. She handed me my change with a smile that suggested she had drawn her own conclusions and found them satisfactory. The first real conversation Phil and I had, the second overall, the first one that lasted more than 5 minutes, happened 9 days after he arrived. Because a section of the boundary fence had come down in the night, and 3 of his newly arrived sheep had decided my kitchen garden was extremely promising territory. I discovered this at 7 in the morning when I went outside to check on the raised beds I'd started building and found a small, round, entirely unrepentant ewe sitting on top of my pile of reclaimed timber. I stood there for a moment, looked at the ewe, and then went over the wall to knock on Phil's door. He answered it in the kind of state that suggested he'd been awake for a while, boots already on a mug of coffee in one hand, a look on his face that processed my presence and arrived at comprehension in about 2 seconds. They got through. 3 of them, I confirmed. 1 is in my kitchen garden. He swore under his breath, set the mug down inside the door, and came out. We retrieved the sheep together, which was one of those experiences that teaches you a lot about a person in a very short time. Phil was patient with the animals in a way that didn't look like performance. He knew how to move around them, how to not startle them, when to be still, and when to act. Watching someone competent do a physical thing they know how to do is, in my experience, one of the more compelling sights available to a person, and I was firmly, absolutely not dwelling on this as I helped herd the 3rd sheep, the ewe, from the timber pile back through the gap in the fence. When they were contained and the fence had been temporarily secured with materials, Phil pulled from a weathered supply shed with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. He looked at my kitchen garden and then looked at me with an expression that was somewhat pained. "I'm sorry about your beds." "They didn't break anything significant," I said, which was mostly true. Some of the edges had been scuffed, and one small plank had been knocked sideways. They were very polite about it, given the circumstances. He looked at me. Then, slowly, something in his face softened and he laughed. A genuine, unguarded sound that I was absolutely not filing away in any significant way. "I'll fix the fence properly today," he said. "I can help," I offered. "I've been meaning to assess the full boundary line anyway." He looked at me again in that calm, measuring way he had, as if he was checking something against an internal standard. "All right," he said. "I'll make more coffee first." That was how I ended up sitting at Phil Casey's kitchen table at 7:30 in the morning, drinking coffee that was considerably better than my own. Learning that he had spent the previous 4 years working on a farm in the north as a hired hand while saving to buy his own land. That he had grown up in the countryside before his family moved to a city when he was a teenager, and had spent the years since trying to make his way back to something that felt real in the specific way that land does. That he had an easy relationship with silence, a quality I valued extremely highly in other people, and a tendency to say what he meant without ornamentation. He didn't ask me a lot of questions about myself. Not in an incurious way, more in the way of someone who understood that people share what they're ready to share, and that patience is a form of respect. I found myself offering things anyway. My background in landscape design, which I'd left behind because it had started feeling like performing the idea of the natural world rather than inhabiting it. The farmhouse's previous owner, an elderly woman named Doris Morrow, who had been the last of a family that had held the land for 3 generations. The way the house still smelled faintly of her herb bundles when I'd first arrived. Phil listened the way he moved around his animals, attentive, unhurried, not filling silences for the sake of filling them. We fixed the boundary fence in the afternoon, working side by side along the hedgerow and the stone wall sections. And the rhythm of working alongside someone competent and quiet was one of the best things I had felt in a long time. I did not tell him I was an omega. I did not tell him because it was private and recent and something I had spent years managing the public dimensions of. I did not tell him because I was not interested in watching someone I had just started to find interesting rearrange their behavior around a label. I went home that evening with dirt under my fingernails and a feeling like something in my chest had unclenched by some small, meaningful degree. The week settled into something I hadn't expected quite this quickly, a rhythm. Not a shared one, exactly. We kept our own schedules, our own projects, our own separate lives on our separate properties, but something adjacent to shared. A rhythm of proximity, of knowing that the light in the East farmhouse kitchen meant Phil was up early again, of occasionally meeting at the boundary wall while doing our separate work, and talking for a time, and then returning separately to our respective tasks. He brought sheep to full health that had been transport stressed when they arrived. I built my raised beds and started seedlings in the farmhouse's south-facing window. He repaired the old stone barn on his property in the evenings, carrying materials in the long summer dusk. I stripped the wallpaper from the second bedroom, all 3 layers of it, and found beneath the deepest layer a faded pencil sketch of a bird on the plaster that I carefully photographed and left in place when I replastered. We ate together perhaps once a week, alternating between farmhouses. Phil cooked with the same quality he brought to everything: simple, honest, good. I cooked with more elaboration, and he ate everything with an appreciation that was deeply satisfying. We talked about the land, about what we were doing, what we were learning, what the fields were telling us about drainage and sunlight and all the slow, quiet language of agricultural soil. We talked about other things too. Books, the particular quality of the silence at different times of day, the nature of what we were each trying to build, separately and somehow in parallel. I began to understand Phil Casey as a person in the way that you can only understand someone when geography forces a particular kind of proximity. Gradual, organic, no exit. He was stubborn in the best sense of the word. Once he decided something was the right way forward, he committed entirely and without complaint. He was not prone to anxiety, which was restful. He had a dry, spare sense of humor that revealed itself slowly, always landing quietly and always landing well. He was also, unmistakably, an alpha whose instincts were extremely well managed. I could feel this in the specific quality of his presence. There was a steadiness to it, a groundedness that was different from ordinary temperament. An alpha choosing not to lean on their secondary nature is a choice you can feel if you're paying attention, like watching someone carry something heavy without letting it show. Phil made that choice consistently and without apparent effort, and it meant that being around him was, against all of my cautiously constructed habits, consistently comfortable. My own omega nature was, in the meantime, doing its best to be inconvenient. I had been on suppressants for most of my adult life. Not because my heat cycles were severe, they weren't, particularly, but because cycling without a bond in an urban environment full of mixed dynamics had seemed like unnecessary exposure. I had continued the prescription when I left the city out of habit mostly. But the rural air and the physical work and the sleeping well and the general settling of my nervous system were conspiring against the medication's complete effectiveness in a way I was monitoring carefully and with some irritation. I was not worried exactly. I had good protocols. I had a doctor in town who I'd registered with during my second week and who had been both competent and discreet. I had a guest room I could lock if needed, and a suppressant prescription I kept current. But the suppressants were doing what suppressants always do when your baseline stress levels drop significantly. They were meeting a calmer system and producing results that required more careful calibration. What this meant practically was that Phil's scent was slightly more present to me than it had been in those early weeks. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, but there, the way a melody is there when you've only half heard it. Occupying a background awareness that I would have preferred to be entirely clear. I did not intend to act on any of it. I did not intend to have any of it be relevant at all. I had not, in my whole adult life, had a relationship that worked. I had had connections, and close ones, and a relationship in my early 20s that I thought was love, until it became apparent that what it had actually been was 2 anxious people using each other as stabilizers. The ending of it had been one of the quieter devastations, the kind that doesn't make noise and therefore has to be processed without the catharsis of drama. I had done that processing, I believed, honestly and completely, but it had left me with a careful architecture around the more vulnerable parts of myself, and I was not in the business of dismantling careful architecture without very good reason. Phil Casey, on his side of the boundary wall, appeared to be managing his own quiet life with similar self-possession. He did a date, if anyone in the village had expressed interest, and Sandra at the bakery had told me, with absolutely no preamble, that he'd turned down an invitation from someone whose name she didn't mention. He'd been politely declining. He spent his evenings with his animals, or with books, or working on the barn. He called his mother on Sunday evenings. I could sometimes hear his voice from across the fields, not the words, just the warm, low register of a long and easy conversation with someone who knew him well. He was building something here, so was I. We were building separate things with quiet concentration, side by side, and the fact that I found this man more compelling with every week that passed was a personal fact that I was managing internally and with great discipline. This worked well as an approach until the Saturday in August, when I had a low-grade preheat response that my adjusted suppressant dosage had not fully contained. And Phil came over to help me repair a section of roof tiles I'd been dealing with for a week, and everything became considerably more complicated. The morning started well enough. I'd taken an additional dose early in the day, eaten properly, and told myself firmly that it was a manageable situation. I had a roof that needed attention, and a neighbor who had offered to help, and there was no reason why the day could not proceed normally. Phil arrived at 9:30 with tools and without ceremony, and we went up onto the roof. Well, he went up onto the roof, and I handed things up from the top of the ladder. As my relationship with heights is more philosophical than practical, and he worked methodically through the loose and broken tiles while I kept inventory and mixed the bonding compound below. The day was warm. The kind of late summer warm that has real heat in it, and we'd been working for about 2 hours when he came down from the roof, took his jacket off, and rolled up his sleeves while he assessed the progress. And I realized, with the specific clarity of someone whose suppression is not fully functional, that my capacity to behave normally about Phil Casey's forearms was significantly lower than I had assumed. I turned back to the bonding compound with great concentration. "You need a break," he said, from just behind me, and I managed not to startle. "I'm all right." He came around to stand beside me and looked at my face with that calm attentiveness, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a door that moves half an inch and then stops. "Matt." "I'm fine," I said, and I meant for my voice to be perfectly even, and it mostly was. He said nothing for a moment. His scent was very present. Warm cedar and earth, and something underneath that I didn't have a precise name for, but that my entire body was deeply, inconveniently interested in. "Do you need me to go?" he asked, very quietly. The fact that he had read the situation correctly and responded to that reading with an immediate offer to leave was one of the most respectful things anyone had ever said to me. It also meant that pretending there was nothing to read was no longer an option. "I'm an omega," I said, evenly, because it was a fact. "I manage it well. My calibration is slightly off today. I'd appreciate if we could just keep working." He was quiet for a beat. "Of course." Another beat. "Are you actually all right? Not managing it all right, actually." The distinction he was drawing was so precise and so kind that it did something unfortunate to my composure. "I'm actually all right," I said. "I just need to be a bit careful today." "Do you want me to work from the other side of the house for a bit? Give you space?" "That would help." "Yes." He nodded, picked up the materials he needed, and went without any further commentary, and I stood in the partial shadow of the farmhouse wall and breathed very carefully for about 2 minutes until my system down-regulated to something workable. We finished the roof that afternoon. He kept a comfortable distance without making it pointed. When he left, he said only, "Let me know when the grout's dried properly. I want to see if there's a similar issue on my east slope," and I said I would, and neither of us made it anything more than what it was. I stood at my kitchen table after he left and looked at the wall in the direction of his farmhouse and understood with the uncomfortable clarity that certain moments force on you, that what I felt about Phil Casey was not a manageable low-level interest. It was something with considerably more mass to it than that. Something that had been accumulating quietly, like snow, and had just revealed itself to be significant. This was not, I told myself, a reason to do anything. People felt things. People felt significant things about other people all the time, and managed those feelings responsibly and lived good lives. I made dinner and went to bed and spent a while looking at the ceiling and then eventually slept. And in the morning, the situation had not resolved itself, but the world was still present and needing attention. And that was, as it generally is, a sufficient reason to get up. September arrived with wind and the smell of changing things, and Phil and I both, separately and then collaboratively, began preparing for the first real test of what we were building. His sheep were established on the pasture and thriving. He'd identified a section of the east field that would work for root vegetables next year and had begun the slow process of soil amendment. The barn was structurally sound, and he'd cleaned and reorganized it with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. He was, in the plain assessment I'd arrived at, someone who built things well and tended them. My kitchen garden was producing. Not abundantly, first-year gardens rarely do, but consistently and with promise. I had tomatoes, courgettes, a row of climbing beans that had somewhat taken over their supports, and a herb section that was fragrant and, in some sections, approaching unruly in a way I didn't entirely mind. The orchard to the south of the house, 6 apple trees and 2 pear trees that Doris Morrow had planted decades before, was bearing fruit for the first time under my care. And I had been reading everything I could find about traditional preserving methods, because the prospect of wasting any of it felt genuinely wrong. Phil appeared at my kitchen door one Saturday morning in mid-September with a bushel basket over one arm and a direct look and said, "Sandra at the bakery told me you've been asking about preserving. I know how to do jam. Do you want help?" "You know how to make jam," I said. "My grandmother taught me. I'm not precious about it." I looked at him for a moment. He looked back, steady and uncomplicated. "Come in," I said. That day is one of the ones I return to when I think about that autumn. The kitchen full of the smell of simmering fruit and sugar. Phil's large hands working with surprising precision over the cutting board. The window fogged from the steam, turning the garden outside into a watercolor impression of itself. We talked while we worked. About his grandmother, about my own family, about the particular, specific pleasure of making something that would last through a season you couldn't yet see. There was a domestic ease to it that I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever, and I was careful not to examine it too directly in case the examination disturbed it. We made 8 jars of apple jam and 5 of pear. And Phil carried 3 of each back to his farmhouse, with a formality that was somewhat belied by the fact that he nearly dropped one on the step and swore softly, and then caught it with a reflex that suggested his hands knew what they were doing, even when his attention wandered. "Good catch," I said. He looked at the jar in his hand and then at me with an expression that, for just a moment, was something other than his usual steadiness, something a little warmer, a little less managed. "Good jam," he said, and went home. The storm came in October, which anyone with farm sense could have predicted, and which we had both, to different degrees, prepared for. Phil's sheep were in the barn by the time the wind picked up properly. My seedling equipment was stored. I had sandbags along the most vulnerable section of the kitchen garden wall, and Phil had helped me carry them without being asked, arriving the evening before the storm with his truck and a look of practical intent that I had found more reassuring than I strictly cared to examine. The storm hit at about 2 in the morning. Not catastrophic, not the kind of storm that redefines things, but serious. Wind that had weight to it and rain that came sideways and a sound on the roof that tested the tiles we'd repaired in August. The tiles held. The kitchen garden wall lost a section on the north end. The boundary fence between our properties came down in 2 places. At 6 in the morning, in the gray, wet aftermath, I was outside in my waterproof assessing the damage when I looked up and saw Phil coming over the wall, ducking through the gap in the fence. He was soaked. I was soaked. We were both standing in mud, surveying wreckage, and there was something very honest about the moment. The world had expressed itself, and we were still there, making an inventory. "Your wall," he said, looking at the fallen stones. "I see it." "Your tiles?" "Held." "Yours?" "One section needs replacing." He pulled his hood back, which in the rain was largely a philosophical gesture. "Sheep are fine." "Good. We stood in the rain and looked at the damage together and then, without particular discussion, started dealing with it. He helped me move the heaviest fallen stones from the garden wall to a position where they could be reinstated without getting in the way of other things. I helped him assess his fence line and identify what needed immediate repair versus what could wait for better conditions. We worked in silence for a while, just the sound of rain and the specific focused language of two people who know how to work. At some point, I realized that I was cold in a way that had gone beyond mere temperature and was becoming systemic. And Phil must have noticed something in my posture because he said without preamble, "Come inside, you're inside. I'll make coffee and then we'll carry on." I wanted to argue, but the argument that presented itself, that I was perfectly fine, was too obviously false to serve. We went inside. Phil made coffee while I changed out of the wettest layers, and when I came downstairs, he was standing at my kitchen counter with his back to me waiting for the kettle. And his wet jacket was on the back of the kitchen chair, and the line of his shoulders in the dark knit of his jumper it was just a set of shoulders, I told myself. They were just shoulders. I sat down at the table. He brought 2 mugs over and sat across from me, and we drank coffee in the particular silence of people who are tired and cold and satisfied with what they've done with their morning. And it was one of those moments that is impossible to accurately describe because it is made entirely of small things. Steam from the mugs, rain on the window, the smell of wet wool and coffee, and him. The sound of his breathing across a kitchen table in a farmhouse that was becoming more mine every day, and small things stacked with patience become something very large. "Matt?" he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at his coffee, then at me. His gray eyes were very direct. "I want to say something, and I want you to know that whatever you say back, nothing changes about this." He made a small gesture that seemed to indicate the entire arrangement of our adjacent lives. "This doesn't change." My chest had gone very still. "Say it then," I said. He said, "I think I'm in love with you." Very evenly, the way he said most things. I'd been thinking about it for a while, and I'm fairly sure that's the right word. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I wanted you to know, because I think you're honest, and I want to be honest with you." I looked at him for a long moment. The careful architecture around the vulnerable parts of myself was present. I could feel it. All those precisely placed supports and well-considered distances. I could feel them the way you feel. A structure when you're standing inside it, aware of the walls even when you're not touching them. I said, "I'm in love with you too." He went very still. "I've been," I said, "for quite some time. I've been managing it." "Managing it," he repeated, and something in his expression was both very precise and very soft. "I'm careful," I said, "about that kind of thing. I have reasons." "I know," he said. I'm not pushing. I mean what I said. This stands regardless." "I know you mean it," I said. "That's part of why." We sat with that for a while. The rain continued. The coffee went slightly cold. Neither of us seemed particularly inclined to move quickly, which felt appropriate. "What would you need," he asked eventually, "to be not just managing it?" It was such an exact question, the kind of question that only someone paying very close attention could formulate. "Time," I said. I'm not opposed to what this could be. I just don't move fast. I never have." "That's fine," he said, simply. "I'm not going anywhere." Looking at him across that kitchen table, wet-haired and steady and entirely himself, I believed him in the way that you only believe someone when you've had the chance to watch them be consistent over a long enough period that the consistency itself becomes the argument. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he agreed. He went back out into the rain to deal with his fence, and I went out to deal with mine. And we worked separately for the rest of the morning and met again at the wall at noon to establish what still needed doing. And the whole world was 6 inches to the left of where it had been that morning. And also, in some way I couldn't entirely explain exactly where it had always been. What followed was the least dramatic love story I had ever been adjacent to, and I mean that in the best possible sense. Phil did not press. He had said what he said, and he let it rest there, solid and undemanding, and returned to being exactly himself, present, consistent, honest. The difference was only that there was now, between us, an acknowledged territory, not mapped yet, not entered with any particular ceremony, just named and therefore real in a new way. We continued as before, largely, working our own land, eating together, meeting at the wall. The rhythm persisted, deepened, became comfortable in a way that felt like something I had been trying to find for a long time without knowing the right words for it. The difference was in the smaller things. The way I would look up from working in the garden and find him watching from across the wall, not staring, not intrusive, just present in the way that someone is present when you matter to them. And then he would look back down at whatever he was doing with a completeness that suggested he'd gotten what he needed from the moment. The way I started leaving a light on in the kitchen window when I was going to be up late, not deliberately as a signal, and then realized I was doing it deliberately as a signal, and didn't stop. The way our conversations in the evenings stretched longer without either of us initiating the stretching, just naturally extending the way good things do when nobody is trying to cut them short. One evening in November, sitting at his kitchen table after dinner, he'd made a lamb stew that was one of the best things I'd eaten all year from his own flock with herbs from my garden, which felt like something. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. He didn't say anything, neither did I. It was just his hand, large and warm and steady, over mine on the table. I turned my hand over and held his. That was that, in a way. Or the beginning of that. We moved into something that didn't need to be announced or formalized because it had been arriving for months, and we had both been watching it come. We held hands at his kitchen table and at mine. We sat close together in the evenings, rather than at the usual distance. He put a hand on my back when we were standing side by side looking at something, and it was the specific warmth of intention. Not casual, not performative, just real. I told him, one morning in December, more about the relationship in my 20s. Told him in the way I had processed it, honestly, without drama, because it had been a long time and I had done the work. He listened without interrupting, and when I'd finished he said, "Thank you for telling me," and that was all, which was exactly right. He told me that same evening about a relationship he'd had in his mid-20s. 2 years with someone who had wanted things that moved faster than he could and whose frustration with his pace had become, eventually, a kind of steady erosion that he'd recognized too late. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe something you've come to understand, rather than something that still hurts. But there was enough of the residue left that I could see where his steadiness about pacing came from, where his explicit promise, "Nothing changes, whatever you say," had come from. Two careful people who had both learned something from being hurt, building something slow and right. In January, he kissed me for the first time. We were standing in his barn in the particular cold of a January afternoon, after I'd helped him check on a ewe who had seemed off her feed but turned out to be fine, just watchful. The barn had the smell of hay and linoleum and the close, warm animal presence of sheep, and we were standing side by side looking at the flock, and I turned to say something. I don't remember what. Something ordinary, and he was already looking at me. He leaned down and kissed me. Carefully. His hands came up to hold my face, and his hands were very warm against the cold of my cheeks, and the kiss was exactly like him. Deliberate and unhurried and entirely without ambiguity. I kissed him back, and both of us stood in the barn in the winter cold, and it was one of the simplest and most significant moments of my life. "I've been thinking about doing that," he said, against my temple, "for quite a while." "You should have mentioned it. I mentioned the other part." "Fair," I acknowledged. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I pressed my face briefly against his jaw. He kept his arms around me, and we stood like that in the warmth of the barn and the cold of the day, and his sheep grazed around us with total indifference. And the world outside was gray and quiet and already beginning, imperceptibly, its slow tilt back toward spring. February is the month that looks like winter and smells like change, and I have loved it, Since the farmhouse, in a way I never did before. The fields were still pale, still stripped of their fullness, but underneath the soil you could feel, or I felt spending as much time with my hands in the earth as I did by then, the early, decisive intention of growth. The first seedlings in the south window, the apple trees showing the faintest suggestion of bud. Phil's lambing season beginning, which meant a period of few full nights of sleep and a barn lit at 3 in the morning with the specific industry of new life arriving. I helped with lambing. I had not expected to be useful at it, and he had not expected me to volunteer. But I showed up at 11 o'clock one night in February because his light was on and I could see from across the fields that the barn was active. And when he looked up from where he was kneeling beside a laboring ewe, his face was the tired, focused face of someone who is glad to have company even if he wouldn't have asked for it. "What can I do?" I said, which was the only sensible question. He put me to work. I was not skilled at this, but I was attentive and quick to learn, and I didn't panic, which he told me afterward was genuinely the most useful quality I could have brought. We worked through the night and into the gray dawn, and by the time the morning light was properly established, there were 4 new lambs in the barn, and we were both sitting on hay bales with the particular fatigue of work that has been worth it. Drinking tea from a thermos, Phil had the foresight to prepare hours earlier. "You were good," he said, "at this." "I'll be better next time," I said. "I know what I'm doing wrong." He looked at me sideways. In the early light, with his sleeves rolled back and hay in his hair, and the lines of tiredness honest on his face, he was the most straightforwardly beautiful thing I had ever seen. I thought this calmly, as a plain fact, the way you register that a field in the morning light is beautiful, or that a piece of well-made furniture is beautiful, without drama. With enormous sincerity. "Next time," he echoed, and there was something quietly warm in the way he said it. "I live next door," I said, "and I intend to keep doing that." He turned to look at me properly, and the expression on his face was one I had been accumulating over months, steady, warm, entirely directed at me, and it still, every time, did something significant to my chest. He reached over and brushed a bit of hay from my shoulder with a hand that then stayed, resting gently. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and we sat in the barn in the early morning, with new lambs making small sounds around us, and the light coming up outside, and the whole spring ahead, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Spring proper arrived in stages, each one distinct. The first green showing in the hedgerows, hawthorn beginning, which Phil pointed out with the specific pleasure of someone who knows what they're looking at. The garden waking up with a decisiveness that always surprises me even when I'm watching for it. The orchard in blossom which stopped me in my tracks the first morning it fully opened, all 8 trees at once white and pale pink, filling the air with a sweetness that was exactly what blossom is supposed to be and which I had never stood inside before. I called Phil over. I'm not sure I would have done that the previous autumn, called him simply to come and see something that was too good to see alone. But I did, and he came, and we stood in the orchard together in the April morning light, and he said, "This is extraordinary," in a way that suggested he meant both the orchard and something beyond it. "It blooms every year," I said. "Doris Morrow planted these trees. I'm keeping them going." "You're more than keeping them going," he said. "The yield last year was better than anything the previous owners saw, according to the village records." I looked at him. "You looked up the village records?" "George at the ironmonger has archives," he said, without particular embarrassment. "He's very forthcoming about them." "Of course he is." I looked at the trees again. "I didn't know you'd done that." "I'm interested in what you're building," he said simply. That was Phil Casey. Quiet investigation. Consistent attention. Saying exactly what he meant without fanfare, and meaning it completely. I reached for his hand and found it already reaching for mine, and we stood in the orchard in the blossom light and held on. There was an evening in May, warm enough to sit outside, which the previous months hadn't reliably offered. When we sat on the porch of my farmhouse, with its still slightly sagging left side, and looked out over the garden and the fields beyond, and Phil said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" about whether I want to be doing this on two separate properties indefinitely. I was quiet. Not pressure, he said immediately. Not anything you have to answer tonight. I've been thinking it and I wanted to say it, because I said I wanted to be honest with you. I looked at the fields. The light on them in May evening was gold in a way that made the green almost unbearable in its intensity. I've been thinking about it too, I said. He said nothing, but he moved slightly closer, and I could feel the warmth of him beside me. Not tonight, I said, but not never. That's more than enough, he said. I believed him. And the thing was, I also believed myself, which was newer and more important. I believed my own capacity to want something real and not run from it. To sit on a sagging porch in May and say, not never, and mean it without the machinery of anxiety grinding behind every word. My alpha, I said quietly, not quite meaning to say it aloud. He made a very quiet sound, and his arm came around me, drawing me against his side with a steadiness that was pure him. Unhurried, completely certain. My omega, he said, just as quietly, not claiming, recognizing. We sat like that as the light faded and the night came in across the fields and the garden smelled of warm earth and growing things, and somewhere across the property line, his sheep were quiet in the pasture, and everything was impermanent and everything was ours. The summer we had our first real argument is also the summer. I stopped being afraid of needing him. These two things are related. The argument was about nothing significant in the way that the most revealing arguments never are. It was about a section of the south boundary and whose responsibility a specific drainage problem belonged to. And I had formed a very clear opinion based on the survey documents, and Phil had formed a different clear opinion based on what the land was actually doing, and we disagreed with increasing pointedness across the boundary wall on a Thursday afternoon in late June, until Phil said something flat and I said something sharp, and we both went separately into our separate farmhouses and didn't speak for the rest of the evening. I sat at my kitchen table that night and felt the shape of the silence across the fields, which was completely different from the ordinary quiet of our separation. It had texture. It was uncomfortable in a specific way that was new and that told me something. It told me that I was frightened of it. Not of the argument. The argument was already fading, the substance of it already less important than it had seemed in the afternoon heat, but of the specific shape of silence that meant that Phil and I were not okay, and how wrong that felt, and how much the wrongness of it mattered to me. I had been careful for so long about not needing anyone too much, and here was the evidence that I had failed at it, or rather succeeded at something better, that I had let this matter to me. That this man and his adjacent life and the specific texture of his presence had become something I was frightened to be without. I walked across to his farmhouse at 9 o'clock that evening. He opened the door before I knocked. He had his keys in his hand. I was coming to you, he said. I was coming to you, I said. We stood there for a moment on his doorstep in the June dark, which was not quite full dark because June never is, and the absurdity and the relief of it were the same feeling. The drainage is your responsibility, I said, based on the survey. The drainage is better managed from my side, he said, but I'll take the cost split if you'll take the survey point. That's fair, I said. Good. He stepped back from the door. Come in. I came in, and he made tea, and we sat at his table, and the argument was resolved and behind us, and what remained was something more valuable than either position we'd been holding. The knowledge that we could disagree and come back, that the coming back was already instinct, that neither of us had any interest in the silence that meant wrong with us. I told him that night what I'd understood sitting at my own table. Told him I was frightened of needing him, or had been, and that I thought I was past it, or was working on being past it. He listened and then said, I've been frightened of hoping too much, which is not the same thing but might be related. It might be, I agreed. I hoped for this, he said simply. From before I could quite justify hoping for it. Me too, I said. I just had more architecture to work through first. He smiled at that. The real smile, the one he didn't produce often, and which, when it appeared, had an effect on my chest that I had entirely stopped pretending was manageable. After that, things were easier. Not in the sense of less work or less challenge or less of the ordinary difficulty of building real things in real land, but easier in the way that changes when you stop being cautious about what you have, when you let yourself know with your whole self that it's yours and you're allowed to hold it. Summer went on. The garden produced. His flock grew. We fell into the habit of waking and working and meeting at the end of days in whoever's kitchen was nearest, and the two farms began to feel less like separate operations and more like one arrangement distributed across a boundary wall that we crossed freely and frequently and treated as a technicality. In August, the second August since I'd arrived, a full year after Phil's roof repair day and its complicated aftermath, I had a heat cycle for the first time in years without suppressants. I had decided, with my doctor and with myself, to let my system reset, to stop managing it quite so chemically, and to trust my own rhythms. It was the right decision for a lot of reasons, and I had made it carefully and with good protocols in place. Phil knew, because by then there was very little I kept from him, and because it was relevant. He was matter-of-fact about it in the way he was matter-of-fact about most things. He asked what I needed. I told him primarily space the first day, and the certainty that he was accessible if that changed. He said he would be at his farmhouse, and I could come to him or call him or tell him to stay away entirely. His preference was mine. He said it without a tremor of anything other than care. The cycle was 3 days, and was, to my mild astonishment, not the crisis I had trained myself to manage it as. It was my own body, finding its own level, in a place that had become genuinely mine, and with a person I trusted genuinely and completely. On the second day I went to Phil, and the day was warm and long and entirely ours, and what passed between us was so far beyond what I had let myself expect, that I spent a while afterward simply lying still in the specific warmth of his room and his arms, and thinking about what it means to finally let yourself be actually present inside your own life. "Are you all right?" he asked, in the particular voice he had for moments that were past the reach of everyday language. "Yes," I said. And then, because it was true and he had always told me things straight, I said, "I'm happy." I didn't. I had forgotten what that felt like in a body. I thought it was more of an intellectual thing. He made a sound that was half laugh and very soft, and held me closer. "It's not intellectual," he confirmed. "No," I agreed, "it's really not." The conversation about the boundary, about whether two people on two farms needed to remain on two farms, formally, came in October of the second year, not dramatically but practically, the way most things come between us. He had been fixing the water main that ran along the property line. I had been helping, and we had been working out whether the pipe configuration made more sense, serviced from one side or the other. And we were lying in the grass looking up at the blue autumn sky while the mud dried on our hands, and he said, "From a purely logistical standpoint." "Yes," I said, "it would be simpler." "It would," I agreed. "I'm not suggesting anything that doesn't suit you." I turned my head to look at him sideways in the grass, and he was looking back with those gray eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that meant he was being entirely honest and entirely undemanding at the same time. "It suits me," I said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he took my dirty hand in his dirty hand and held it in the grass between us. "The legal stuff would take a while," he said. "We have time," I said. "We do," he agreed. We lay in the autumn grass looking at the sky and the clouds moving across it, and the idea of our two properties becoming one arrangement, not erasing the individual history of either, not swallowing either farmhouse into the other, just acknowledging what had already organically become true, sat between us in the air like something that had already happened and was only waiting for the paperwork. By the following spring, we had begun the process, not rushing. There was no rush. We were people who understood the value of doing things at the right pace, in the right season. The boundary wall is still there. I like it. It marks the history of two separate arrivals. Two people who came to adjacent places and grew toward each other the way plants do. not by design, but by the logic of what they needed and what was available. We keep the wall as a kind of record. Phil manages the flock and the east fields and the barn that he has rebuilt into something genuinely excellent. I manage the orchard and the kitchen garden and the seedlings in the south window that grow into things we eat and preserve and give away. We share the water main and the drainage and the boundary hedgerow and the kitchen table on which we eat dinner and argue about minor things and look at each other in the ordinary, extraordinary light of evenings that are ours. Sandra at the bakery, when I told her, did not appear surprised. George at the ironmonger nodded as though I had confirmed something long since established. The village absorbed the development with the thoroughness of a community that has been watching a story build and is satisfied with how it's resolved. My omega instincts, which I spent so many years carefully and somewhat defensively managing, have become one of the quieter and more reliable parts of my experience. They know where home is, they have known for some time. I just had to finish being careful enough to find out. Phil Casey, my neighbor, my alpha, the person who leaned on my boundary wall on the morning of his arrival and told me I wasn't going to get through Hawthorne with garden shears. Phil Casey is the most honest person I have ever known and the steadiest and the one who has, without ever demanding it become the center around which my life has organized itself into something I would not trade for any version of any other life I can imagine. I told him this once, not dramatically. We were in the orchard. It's become a habit, standing in the orchard when things are worth saying. In the blossom season, white and pink light falling around us, and I said, I couldn't have planned this. I didn't know I was going to find this. He looked at the trees and then at me. I didn't know either, he said. But I think I was looking for something like it. I just didn't have a name for it. What name would you give it now? I asked. He took my hand, looked at me with those clear, light gray eyes in the blossom light. Home, he said. This is just home. The apple trees bloomed around us. The fields breathed. His sheep called from across the boundary wall, and the sound of them was ordinary and good. The sound of a world that is alive and tended and cared for by people who have decided that this, exactly this, the stone walls and the quiet and the work and each other, is where they belong. I am Matt Buckley. I am 30 years old. I am an omega who moved to the countryside to build something real, and I found, in the farm next door, the realest thing I have ever known. He is Phil Casey. He bought the farm next door. That is the whole of it, and it is everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.